make a couple comments while the panel is getting settled in here. I think that, as a number of people have said today, that this is literally a seminal event for MDIC, but I also think it's a important inflection point culturally for the whole medical technology ecosystem. Collaboration has been part of the ecosystem from the very early days. Oftentimes that was with an innovator and a physician, and we've evolved that to include other stakeholders, and now we're bringing the patient into that collaboration process. And we're also looking at, and you can see from the work that's happened here, how the power of collaboration can include the government, industry, and nonprofits in a way that will ultimately benefit patients. And so our focus, I think, in the guiding beacon that is allowing this to really crystallize is that patient centricity. And I think that's going to be a powerful drive and motivation for continuing this work. And so in that context, the topic of this discussion is future applications of patient preferences. Ross kind of set that up. And I'd like to give, first of all, maybe because you have not been up yet, Bryan, maybe you could at least introduce yourself so that people know a little bit more about your role at PCORI.
Sure. Okay. Well, first of all, it's a real pleasure to be here, and it's been a terrific pleasure to be part of the steering committee. So I'm Bryan Luce, and I'm the Chief Science Officer at PCORI. So our job is to do all the research that Brett and Ross talked about. So I'll be talking more about that in a few minutes.
Great. And Martin, I think this is the first time you've had a chance to speak today as well. So
yes, thank you. My name is Martin Ho. I am a statistician reviewing neurological devices, and I work with TELVA and LTI's Health Solutions to conduct the obesity study at the very beginning, and I was involved in the patient preference initiatives within CDRH throughout the whole time. And before I start to say something else, I want to just to acknowledge Bray, Kim, and Mark. Their involvements in the committee are very, very important. When we were in the deep discussions or debate about what we mean by risk, after 10 minutes later, they will patiently turn around and guide us back to the path that we should be on. So without them, it would be a very academic exercise. So from being a person who conducted and reviewed clinical trials, I hope that clinical trials can equally involve patient and patient advocacy groups and representatives. And I'm pretty sure they can benefit from them as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. And I'm going to stick with you for just a second because I believe you were a very important contributor in the original obesity study research. And thinking about the framework today and how that might influence future applications or research that we could do, be interested in your thoughts in terms of where you think we can go from here with the framework and future applications from your perspective?
I am privileged to be involved first in the obesity study and then in this committee creating this report and also in the guidance creation from CDRH. And from this experience, I learned at least two things. I think the obesity study is a well-done study. It's a group effort. And at the same time, throughout the process of creating this framework report, that makes me aware of the different methods that are available, and they can answer different research questions. Therefore, I would say that even though there are some methods that are more or better established than others at the time, but I personally would think that let's take a look at the available methods that's presented in the report and do some of and use them as the tool to accumulate the patient's preferences or voice. And later, we can gain more experience, then we can have a better evaluation and judgment of the strength and weakness of these evidence. So I am very optimistic that if we keep the field open, then we would learn a lot more in the future.
Great. This is a question I'll open to anybody on the panel, but there's been discussions around benefit risk and when it's an appropriate consideration or of higher significance, if you will, versus other times. Making that more practical, if we look at either disease areas or technology platform, is there therapeutic approaches? Is there particular diseases or areas that we should be thinking about as a area of opportunity or focus where this framework could be applied as it stands today and have significant impact? Go ahead.
I've focused on a lot of drug development work in Johnson & Johnson. I've seen benefit risk problems with hardcore benefit risk trade-offs in many therapeutic areas, and I've seen all therapeutic areas have some of the easy wins where it's obvious that you have good benefits compared to the alternatives. The harms are not strong or occur very infrequently. So I don't think the decision would be therapeutic area based. I think it's more the nature of the problem. Are there intrinsic benefits and intrinsic harms that you have to balance in that particular area? One I'm familiar with, just to give you an example, an anticoagulant. An anticoagulant is going to prevent clots, so it'll prevent strokes and heart attacks, could prevent death, but it will cause bleeding. That trade-off is inherent in the anticoagulant problem, and benefit risk will always be there. In other problems, like biologics I've seen, for whatever reason, they tend to have very few harms in addition compared to the alternative treatments. Those teams, they're not really interested in pre-specifying benefit risk. They just want to have a discussion of it at the end.
Okay. Martin, you had I think you raised your hand.
Yes, as someone who reviews neurological device, I'm biased. So I think neurological device area is, especially the neuromodulation type of devices are very important, especially for those that are highly invasive permanent implant. Patients there are facing a very difficult trade-off. On one hand, if they were drug resistant, for example, epilepsy, there were not many options for them to receive treatment. So if they are being left with a choice of receiving a permanent implant, then perhaps that would help inform the reviewers within our centers to make a regulatory decision.
Yes. Ross?
Yeah, I want to follow up with that because I think there's a broader context. In the treatment of chronic disease, much of what we use today is medication. And what we're seeing, at least I see coming down the pike, are a lot of device interventions designed to treat chronic disease, which is unusual. The first, probably the most visible one is renal denervation for hypertension. And these types of issues raise different types of benefit risk questions, because with drugs, the question is what's the benefit and risk over time? The long-term complications of drugs, the hassle of taking drugs, how they make you feel, all those issues tend to play over long periods of time versus the risk of the intervention and then how well the benefits play out over time. And I think these temporal trade-offs, as well as these sort of different experiences of using the product, acute intervention versus a long-term use, or even with a non-invasive neurostim device versus a drug, the different types of side effects, the different types of hassles of use and taking. I think all those issues raise questions, and they're often apples to oranges questions. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think patient preference information can be very valuable in helping understand whether patients prefer apples or oranges, and how they're going to get at that.
Yeah.
There's one other insight. A lot depends on what you're comparing against. If I have a new device or a new drug and there's really a huge medical need, you're almost certainly going to be giving much more benefit than harm, just because there's just nothing available. But as people build more and more devices, more and more drugs, in many cases, the incremental benefits get smaller and smaller. And suddenly you're not comparing something against nothing. You're comparing something against something good. And some of those differences then become a lot smaller, and the ability to trade off against them and to convert apples and orange differences into preferences becomes more important. That transcends any therapeutic area. That's just the nature of technological or drug development.
Yeah. So it's not apples and oranges, it's Granny Smith versus Fuji, right?
Well, actually, I think it is apples to oranges, because Granny Smith versus Fuji, that's an attribute, and you're looking at the so.
Thanks for
but I do think the drug device comparison. There isn't. That's a hard question. I mean, I'm working on a study currently. Because you are talking apples to oranges. The attributes of one are different than the attributes of the others, different risks, same objective, but the process is different. Those are harder to frame. And a lot of the preference work that you see is drug to drug or device to device. And as Telva pointed out, the weight loss study was device to device. That's nice and neat. It gets complicated both clinically and from a preference perspective when you're talking about drugs versus devices or in combination, and we're seeing that happen. So I think that type of work is going to be important moving forward. It's also hard, and it's going to take some investment and thought to be able to do that well.
Good point.
And when you throw in behavioral interventions, that you have a whole different scenario here that also tend to be competitive in a lot of these areas.
So Bryan, you mentioned earlier in a comment, PCORI's focused primarily in the post-market space. In the context of this particular framework report, do you see an application where the report could be of use to within the PCORI construct?
Yeah, very much so. I've been doing a lot of thinking about that. It has been mentioned by several folks here. PCORI is involved with engagement all the way through, and the fundamental aspects of patient preference is really infused in everything we do, but not necessarily systematically. And we haven't tackled patient preference in a systematic way as this report has done. And so as I see it, the report in the compendium has laid a foundation that I can imagine PCORI building off from. Our methodology committee has developed a methodology report of 47 standards of methodological standards for for patient-centered outcomes research, comparative effectiveness research. It has not tackled patient preference, which is a surprise actually when you think about it now, since it's so obviously central to patient-centered outcomes research. I have just yesterday actually, sent the draft reports to the entire methodology committee and have put it on the agenda of an upcoming meeting to discuss this. I guess I would guess that the answer will come back that they're not ready for standards, but I can imagine they're taking a next step in terms of providing some guidance for comparative effectiveness research, that alone. The other major area that is very obvious is just a terrific research agenda that Brett and others have all put together, and that we have a very robust comparative effectiveness research portfolio of studies, of course, but one of our programs is methodological research in comparative effectiveness research, and that has we are funding some work. I was talking to John Bridges. I won't mention where we were talking, just a couple of hours ago, and he was one of our studies, and we have some studies, method studies associated with patient preference, but nothing systematic. We also so I can imagine an announcement, for instance, that is very specific to many of the issues that have been raised in this report.
Thank you.
And I've got other things to say too, but I'll
go. Yes.
Just to follow up what Bryan said, during the break I had a conversation with Bryan, and we were talking about an idea that he mentioned a year ago to me, which is within PreConnect there are many shared decision-making tools presented and in place. But as Bryan has said, there was no systematic evaluation of those tools. And then by looking at Ross' vision or future research agenda, the shared decision-making tool is actually one of our main point of interest. So therefore, I think it would be a very good item to work on is to develop some guidelines or criteria to evaluate those shared decision-making tools. And I'm asking for that is because that not only helps us to further the research agenda by itself, but also it would help us to achieve another important goal of the guidance, which is the preference-based indicated labeling, in which we are trying to identify patients who are willing, for given benefit, they are willing to tolerate certain level of risk. And if we have an effective shared decision-making tool with certain validity exists, then we would have a very good confidence in the decision that we make and the format that we use in the labeling. But that's only my personal opinion. It doesn't reflect the FDA's bill.
Sure. Let me follow up with that. We've actually funded a great deal of decision assist tools, especially the first 2 or 3 years, to the point where we actually sent a signal out to the community that we didn't want any more until we figured out what we have. But we haven't evaluated them and what's come in relative to patient preference, and that'd be another example. I also want to, actually building off of your question initially, earlier on this morning I asked about the application of the kind of data that comes out of the clinical trials pre-market to the post-market scenario, the efficacy to effectiveness transition, and the degree to which the data and the evidence that is presented and used in the regulatory process is germane to the real world. That has to be done, and that is something clearly that is in the wheelhouse, I think, of PCORI. And to get to the apples and apples things, I'll switch to the enchilada. The big enchilada, actually, that no one spoke about that I've heard today is so what? What difference does including patient preference mean ultimately in the changes in health and outcomes? And that is the ultimate thing you want to know. The assumption here is that it makes a difference. It's clearly an appropriate thing to do from a customs and what we're all about and so forth. The real question is, does it make a difference? And that is something that PCORI can and should do.
Just try to follow up with Bryan's brilliant idea, one of them again. And earlier this morning, Brad had mentioned some research already are trying to emerge about using patient preferences in studying health services. So I'm thinking that just by following the simple logic of patients who follow the treatment regimens that they prefer, they will be more likely to have a better compliance with the treatment regimen. Perhaps by combining patient preferences with treatment regimen, we can do some type of pragmatic trial intervention experiment.
Just to Martin's point, Bryan, I agree with your question. That is the ultimate question. What does that do for health? the patient preference trials or the trial cohort designs, I mean, have demonstrated clearly in a lot of cases that if you can allow people to choose their arm in the trial, those who have the option to choose their preferred arm do better off. The outstanding question is why, and is that generalizable? But I do think there's precedent for that. The question is, how do we take that one step further? And does it have to be in the role of a trial? Can we do it in another way? I haven't thought about that personally, and I don't know of anyone who's quite done that. There has been work on how do you translate efficacy into effectiveness. There's the behavioral component. What's that going to do to adherence, persistence, proper use, all of those things. But I think there's a huge opportunity there for research. That certainly if Fakori were to be at the forefront of that could make a huge difference.
One question for each of the panelists. Now that this report is out, what do you believe the next priority for the MDIC work group should be? If you had one area of focus that we should pursue, what should that be? And we can just go down the line, and I'd like to end with Ross because he's a steering committee champion. So, yeah. So, Bryan, do you have, you want to start?
Well, I'd love to see, it's a good question. Because what I would like to see come out of this is the next step in the research, and in many ways I see that as a Fakori role. But we don't do this kind of research pre-market. So I forget who mentioned, maybe you did, Kim, that we need data. And so generating more pilot studies and data is obviously something that you all can do. The methodological work itself has to get done, and whether that's more of a Fakori issue, it's clearly a Fakori issue, whether that's a MDIC, something that you want to move into, that would be extremely welcome. Those are the things that come to my mind.
Okay, great.
So by looking at the future research agenda, it seems like we can use one sentence to summarize it. Is let's do more, and then we learn from them. And so as a reviewer at FDA, I would like to see that some sponsor will take a look at the framework report and determine that the device will fit into the decision, the preference-sensitive decision. And based on that, they come to the FDA and talk with us, and then we can plan and discuss a meaningful study for a meaningful patient preference study to conduct, and then we both the sponsor and the CDRH will keep an open mind and learn from those data and incorporate them into our regulatory decision making.
I think the proof of concept and the actual implementation of that has been done. I mean, we have one really good case study in the weight loss example and the Maestro approval. The next question that comes to mind for me, having not been involved in the process of the decision, is how do you identify who those people are for whom the benefits outweigh the risk? Because they may look identical on paper. Mm-hmm. You know, it may be that just their preferences differ, even though I can't explain to you why mine are different than Ross's, even if we have all the same characteristics. Then the natural follow-on to that, in my mind, is how do you ensure that when the person for whom this may be available has to make that determination, that they have been well-informed, whatever that means, so that they're making the decision in the right framework, not the right decision per se, but what's right for them with the right information. That's outside my area of expertise, but to me that seems like the logical, pragmatic next step is how do you implement that decision in the real world?
I would like to see, my preferences are, three lines of work. The first is, you've heard before, more examples. Not just not academic examples, but ones that can be applied to real-world devices or potentially drugs or combination devices that are going up for review and ask, did this reference study help? What did we learn from it? Was it worth the investment, you might say? The second is very much what Brett was described. Follow the process through to the point of contact between a physician and patient and see if our hypothesis that patients will self-identify their preferences in a shared decision-making context really works. In theory, it should. Let's see how it works. If we said pick the obesity example, go all the way down to the patient and physician talking and see if they come up with the same type of characteristics that they care about as came up in the preference study. And the third is that there are a variety of important questions that were identified that for the research agenda that are not just academic. I think ones about validation and reproducibility are extremely important from a regulatory perspective. If we want this data to be taken just as seriously as clinical trial data, we want to make sure that we can trust this information. That'll require standards too, and it may be a combination of policy and research on validation.
Yes, you want me to answer this question, or do you have another one for me?
No, I was going to, but you were at the end. I didn't want it to unduly influence what others said.
I appreciate that. Well, I argue with the fundamental preference. I don't think there's just one thing we need to be doing here. I think fundamentally we need more experience. And what I'd love to see is another specific example of preference work being done that leads to that it really informs and maybe influences and changes a regulatory decision, like I think the obesity study did with the Maestro approval, where there's a fascinating study where the study didn't hit its primary endpoint, but it showed good benefit and enough benefit that under a preference-informed benefit-risk assessment, the approval was given. And I'd love to see another example in another field, and whether that comes out of an individual company decided to do their own study and presenting that to the FDA, or whether it's another broad study that helps define the important issues in the field that then informs a regulatory decision of a specific product coming through. I think we need that more than anything. From a point of view of ongoing work, clear a lot of interest in methods and validation and whether methods are consistent. I'm particularly interested in how we learn to communicate better to patient. I think our informed consent process in this country needs to be dramatically refined and improved for a variety of reasons. One, it's the right thing to do for patients. Secondly, I think it would be helpful for organizations to have a good informed consent process consistently done from a liability point of view, from ensuring good outcomes point of view. And so I think the working communication of benefit risk information to patients and so that they can actually express their preferences in their individual case is really, really important. And so those are the areas I'd focus the most on. Just as an aside, vis-a-vis the conversation earlier about how decisions influence outcomes, some research I was involved with back in the mid-'80s, longer ago than I'd like to, with Jack Wimberg up at Dartmouth on outcomes, showed that if patients are involved in the decision process, independent of the outcome, they're more satisfied with it. So even if they have a bad outcome, they're more satisfied with the outcome. So I think in the end, as a patient, as a citizen, as someone who's used to deliver care, I think it's most important that we really learn how to inform patients, have them be involved in the decision making if we're going to optimize outcomes in our healthcare system. And so I hope that eventually this train will lead to that station, as it were.
Right.
A couple of other things. The first is I'd stay on this horse. I wouldn't consider, my recommendation would be you don't consider this as a one-off study. I'd definitely stay on it, and there are a lot of different things you could do. Secondly, I would engage in extensive communication dissemination. I mean, what we're doing here today is terrific, but it's not enough. I would stay on that alone. I mean, it's a powerful message, especially in that it's both the private sector and the FDA together. It's really powerful. And then with respect to PCORI's entire agenda is built around stakeholders telling us what to do. That's sometimes a problem. But that is how we develop our agenda. Mm-hmm. You all are stakeholders, and you're really important stakeholders. And you're coming in on the 19th to present to Corey. I'm going to be talking to you more about it, and I'd love to have the FDA involved with that seminar or what we put together. But I would focus it less on the actual study you did and more on what you want Corey to do to build off the study.
Any questions? It looks like there's one in the back. Yes, Reed?
I have been kind of waiting for this day for almost 20 years. And I have this weird feeling that I should have been more careful about what I asked for. So I have a couple of concerns. One is, Reed Johnson at Duke University was at RTI doing the obesity study. One of my colleagues at RTI, a PRO expert, said that the PRO guidance, the FDA PRO guidance, was the worst thing that ever happened to PRO research. And I'd hate to see that happen here. It is a little stifling to start writing guidelines and rules and standards. My other concern is the scalability of all this. I would guess you could write the names of every qualified state of preference researcher in the world on a single sheet of paper, maybe double-spaced. Where are we going to get the resources and the expertise to be able to do what we're talking about? If a miracle happened and CEDAR adopted similar acceptance of these methods, it would create a gigantic demand. And there is the potential here that everybody will suddenly become a state of preference expert, which will cause real challenges in quality control. So, having set these goals, how are we going to get there? I'd like to hear what the panel has to say about that.
Anybody in particular want to take that?
The second one is the one that's most concerning for me, and Reed's absolutely right. I think John even said so much in that Biomed Central piece that, capacity is an issue in this field. I don't know what the answer is. I know John has talked about initiatives for encouraging and training, and there are more people sort of in the next generation coming up from those of us who have been around to have enough of the gray hair that I now have that I didn't when I started this work, not this project, when I started my career. But I think there needs to be, the capacity constraint is a real thing, and I think John's got some ideas about in building capacity, but it's something that absolutely has to be done. In the meantime, I think the only thing that can be done is to set standards, and this may be contrary to your first point, Reed, that guidance that sets standards that are unreasonable or that box you in can be problematic, and that's what we heard from some of our PRO colleagues. But what are the standards so that that when a preference study is done, that it is of sufficient quality? And I think there are good guidelines. We don't have the kinds of measures that you have in PRO. I think those that could fit on that sheet of paper could tell you what is a good study and what is not, but that's not enough. So I think that is a particular concern. I agree with Reed's point completely on that, and that's up to those of us who are doing it to encourage growth in that field. I don't know, John, if you had any thoughts. You're nodding your head. So.
Thanks very much for that. I totally agree with the issues that have been raised, and I also want to thank Reed for his leadership in this community. He's really been a mentor to many of us in the room getting this forward, and I remember a decade ago he presenting at a ISBOR conference the benefit-risk things that now kind of part of the vernacular, so I really want to thank him for his leadership in that. Cost-effectiveness did it. Cost-effectiveness ramped up to a point where a handful of people could do it to now there being like 20,000 cost-effectiveness analyses in the literature. So I think there are strategies where some of the ways there, we now have an international community of preference researchers, the International Academy for Health Preference Researchers. ISPOR has provided standards, and a number of us have been involved in that. We have on Monday, we'll kick a new ISPOR initiative off called the Patient-Centered Benefit Risk Assessment Group. So to start thinking about what are you doing with it. Society of Medical Decision Making is getting involved in this, and we've taught courses there for the last 5 years, and there's a growing number of fellows there. But I do think partnership is the way to do it. The FDA is not going to do it by itself. PCORI is not going to do it by itself. We have to partner and put resources together and pool resources. And it's not just this problem. This is a great example. Medical devices and preferences is a great example. The preferences can be applied everywhere around the world. I'm doing half a dozen studies in Africa at the moment on different topics. This is a bigger thing. We can pool resources together, share experiences. Other countries, Denmark is way out ahead of us. Germany is maybe, and in some areas we had some more pre-considerations of this. Australia has resources in terms of some of the best stated preference researchers in the world. We need to touch into them and form and say that this is a global issue, just like shared decision making. Or I think the corollary is actually ethical research. If we think about this as an obligation, an ethical obligation, then it becomes the motivation to push this through.
I want to make a comment, a little different twist on this. I think it's important to remember as we started the discussion today, this was truly a collaboration, and I think a cultural transformation in terms of how innovation is occurring. Whenever you have something as significant as what we're talking about here in changing how we think about innovation and incorporating patient centricity into that process, the whole system is going to get strained in certain places because there was an excess capacity to accommodate this significant of a change. On the other hand, I think it's very important to recognize that the standard of safety and efficacy is not changing. This is additional evidence. We won't get it perfect, but I think that's an important context to remember as we go forward, that while we're kind of on this journey, we're keeping that same standard in place. And so this is not, if you will, amplifying the risk for patients. The other thing, which is an important cultural thing, and I've been in this industry for 30 years, and I would say that until I got involved with this job, and even now when I go and talk to many industry colleagues, there has been historically a reticence to engage early and communicate. And part of the way to deal with this, and part of what you're hearing from the agency, is come talk to us. Let's engage early. Let's start this process, because we know that this is a nascent field. We know that there's a lot that needs to be learned, and we want to do it in a collaborative way. It won't solve all of the problems, but it's the way to begin the journey, I think, in the least risk approach possible.
Okay, thank you. If I could just, about the PRO, thing, which we're talking about it a little bit like it's a very mature and in a good place, and we're all happy with it. And I think to Reed's point, we have a guidance that's, we call it the gold standard now, which is a standard that we think is maybe near the perfect, but probably not what we need for many purposes. We need a practical, pretty good approach. Mm-hmm. But one thing that I wonder about when I've been following up with our CDRH colleagues, and maybe this is just a CEDAR problem, but that we don't know enough, and we're hearing in these meetings that even the PROs don't necessarily measure what the patients care about. And we heard this actually from some of our PCORI colleagues, in fact, as they look at PROs. So we don't even know for sure, I'll say for CEDAR in many cases, what are the endpoints the performance characteristics that the patients care about that you'd even want to ask them about in preference solicitation. So we're like back there trying to figure out what endpoints should even be collected in trials. And then we'd have information to maybe give people meaningful preference questions. So I think we're actually got more spade work to do. Maybe it's just drugs, but we have even more to do to even be ready to provide meaningful questions to people for preference solicitation.
I'm sure that's not just unique for drugs, and with the heterogeneity of devices, there's some that are going to be clearer than others for sure, but the same issue I can say is, I'm sure, is there for devices as well. Kim, I think you had a question?
I'm going to make this point to build on what Brett and Reed and John have mentioned about capacity, because it's an issue not only for the academic researchers who do this kind of work, but also in the patient community and the federal agencies. And I go to these meetings, and Rob Califf is here, so I'm going to say this. I go to a lot of meetings across a whole bunch of different topics, and you hear about this huge number of PhD scientists that can't find postdoc jobs, and the NIH has to create young investigator mechanisms to help them get their careers started. And then we hear about how few, the hiring problems at FDA and trying to get researchers recruited into these other types of research. It feels like we need some sort of a work rebalancing initiative across all of these domains to get the right people to go into this ethical research, if we want to call it that. And that would solve a lot of problems. So maybe Dr. Califf can work on that.
Well, I was going to say, when are you going to the Hill next?
There is a market pressure point. With CDRH being, let's say, blunt, that we are interested in preference studies, you want us to talk to you, companies will start putting money into them, which means that companies that are wondering, vendors, companies like RTI and academic groups that could potentially hire people to do this now have more of an incentive. So we're going through a transitional period, and it will be stressful as Reed describes. But the market pressure probably will solve it. Just maybe by then some other problem will come up.
One last comment from Martin, and then I think we'll need to move on.
Okay, sure. To follow up with Bennett's, I want to second Bennett's response and Bryan as well. And I also want to say that before PRO widely accepted within CDER, it takes a while for it to get mature and develop. But if we don't measure something, we would never understand them. So I think this report is just a starting point for us to have somewhere to go to and to get our research agenda started.